Pyrrho. Pyrrho of Elis, /Pyrrho/ Ancient Greek, Pyrrho rho omega nu lambda epsilon omicron sigma, romanized, Pyrrho Ēleios, circa 360, circa 270 BC, was a Greek philosopher of classical antiquity and is credited as being the first Greek skeptic philosopher and founder of Pyrrhonism. Life. Pyrrho of Elis is estimated to have lived from around 365 to 360 BC until 275 to 270 BC. Pyrrho was from Elis, on the Ionian Sea. Diogenes Laertius, quoting from Apollodorus of Athens, says that Pyrrho was at first a painter, and that pictures by him were exhibited in the gymnasium at Elis. Later he was diverted to philosophy by the works of Democritus, and according to Diogenes Laertius became acquainted with the Megarian dialectic through Bryson, pupil of Stilpo. Pyrrho, along with Anaxarchus, traveled with Alexander the Great on his exploration of the East, so that he even went as far as the Gymnosophists in India and the Magi in Persia. This exposure to Eastern philosophy seems to have inspired him to create a new philosophy and to adopt a life of solitude. Returning to Elis, he lived in poor circumstances, but was highly honored by the Eleans, who made him a high priest, and also by the Athenians, who conferred upon him the rights of citizenship. Sources on Pyrrho. Pyrrho did not produce any written work detailing his philosophical principles. Most of the information on Pyrrho's principles comes from his most notable follower, Timon, whose summary of Pyrrho's teachings are preserved in the Aristocles passage. However, there are conflicting interpretations of the ideas presented in this passage, each of which leads to a different conclusion as to what Pyrrho meant. Most biographical information on Pyrrho, as well as some information concerning his demeanor and behavior, come from the works of mid-3rd century BC biographer Antigonus of Carystus. Biographical anecdotes from Diogenes Laertius are also frequently cited. His work on Pyrrho's life drew primarily from Antigonus' accounts. Philosophy. Pyrrho wrote nothing. His doctrines were recorded in the writings of his pupil Timon of Phlius. Unfortunately, these works are mostly lost. Little is known for certain about the details of Pyrrho's philosophy and how it may have differed from later Pyrrhonism. Most of what we know today as Pyrrhonism comes through the book Outlines of Pyrrhonism written by Sextus Empiricus over 400 years after Pyrrho's death. Most sources agree that the primary goal of Pyrrho's philosophy was the achievement of a state of ataraxia, or freedom from mental perturbation, and that he observed that ataraxia could be brought about by eschewing beliefs, dogma, about thoughts and perceptions. However, Pyrrho's own philosophy may have differed significantly in details from later Pyrrhonism. Most interpretations of the information on Pyrrho's philosophy suggest that he claimed that reality is inherently indeterminate, which, in the view of Pyrrhonism described by Sextus Empiricus, would be considered a negative dogmatic belief. A summary of Pyrrho's philosophy was preserved by Eusebius, quoting Aristocles, quoting Timon, in what is known as the Aristocles passage. It is uncertain whether Pyrrhonism was a small but continuous movement in antiquity or whether it died out and was revived. Regardless, several centuries after Pyrrho lived, Demas led a revival of the philosophy. Pyrrhonism was one of the two major schools of philosophical skepticism that emerged during the Hellenistic period, the other being academic skepticism. Pyrrhonism flourished among members of the empiric school of medicine, where it was seen as the philosophic foundation to their approach to medicine, which was opposed to the approach of the dogmatic school of medicine. Pyrrhonism fell into obscurity in the post-Hellenic period. Pyrrhonists view their philosophy as a way of life, and view Pyrrho as a model for this way of life. Their main goal is to attain ataraxia through achieving a state of epike, i.e., suspension of judgment, about beliefs. One method Pyrrhonists use to suspend judgment is to gather arguments on both sides of the disputed issue, continuing to gather arguments such that the arguments have the property of isosthenia, equal strength. This leads the Pyrrhonist to the conclusion that there is an unresolvable disagreement on the topic, and so the appropriate reaction is to suspend judgment. Eventually the Pyrrhonist develops epike as a habitual response to all matters of dispute, which results in ataraxia. Ancient Indian influences on Pyrrho. Diogenes Laertius' biography of Pyrrho reports that Pyrrho traveled with Alexander the Great's army to India and based his philosophy on what he learned there. The sources and the extent of the Indian influences on Pyrrho's philosophy, however, are disputed. Some elements of philosophical skepticism were already present in Greek philosophy, particularly in the Democritian tradition in which Pyrrho had studied prior to visiting India. Richard heavily discounts any substantive Indian influences on Pyrrho, arguing that on the basis of testimony of one Epicurus regarding how difficult it was to converse with the gymnosophists, as it required 3 translators, none of whom understood any philosophy, that it is highly improbable that Pyrrho could have been substantively influenced by any of the Indian philosophers. According to Christopher I. Beckwith's analysis of the Aristocles passage, a diaphora, a stathmata, and an epicreta are strikingly similar to the Buddha's 3 marks of existence, indicating that Pyrrho's teaching is based on Buddhism. Beckwith disputes Bett's argument about the translators, as the other reports of using translators in India, involving Alexander the Great and Nearchus, say they needed only one interpreter, and one Epicurus was criticized by other writers in antiquity for exaggerating. Beckwith also contends that the 18 months Pyrrho spent in India was long enough to learn a foreign language, and that the key innovative tenets of Pyrrho's skepticism were only found in Indian philosophy at the time and not in Greece. It has been hypothesized that the gymnosophists were Jains, or Ainonians, and that these are likely influences on Pyrrho. Influence. Pyrrhonism regained prominence in the late 15th century. The publication of the works of Sextus Empiricus played a major role in Renaissance and Reformation thought. Philosophers of the time used his works to source their arguments on how to deal with the religious issues of their day. Major philosophers such as Michel de Montaigne, Marin Mersenne, and Pierre Gassendi later drew on the model of Pyrrhonism outlined in Sextus Empiricus' works for their own arguments. This resurgence of Pyrrhonism has been called the beginning of modern philosophy. Pyrrhonism also affected the development of historiography. Historical Pyrrhonism emerged during the early modern period and played a significant role in shaping modern historiography. Historical Pyrrhonism questioned the possibility of any absolute knowledge from the past and transformed later historians' selection of and standard for reliable sources.